I'm going to pass these around. Be careful, they're slippery. Be careful.
No.
Am I on? Am I live?
Yep.
Oh my goodness, I better not say anything bad. Be careful, they're slippery. Could you pass them around? Be careful, they're slippery. You're welcome. Be careful, they're slippery.
No, it throws you anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have one of these, Derek?
I don't.
This is new.
Oh, you got a new
This,
improved?
yeah, there's going to be another one revised as well.
Okay.
You're welcome.
You all set, Bernie? Okay, so good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming out to take part in the 4th annual Benjamin Drummond Emancipation Day celebration. So quick question, how many of you are in the building for the first time today? Okay. Wow. So welcome, and please take a look at our calendar events and feel free to come back over and over and over again. Okay, so some quick housekeeping. If you can take a moment just to silence your mobile phones, that would be great. And also you have 3, and now Dr. Demchek has added 4 pieces of paper with you. One is the At a Glance, which tells you about all of our programming this week, and we have some more programs tomorrow, so take a look at that. You also have a brochure or a program for today. And then you have a survey. I know the survey says walking tour, but we are going to make note of that, so please take the survey for us. This information is crucial for future programming. And so without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel for this afternoon. Today, our moderated discussion is titled Tragedy, Turbulence, Transition, and Transformation, Remembering 1968, Washington, D.C. Our panel this afternoon, we have Dr. Maria McWhorter. She is the curator of DC 1968 Project and author of African American Heritage Trail, Washington, D.C. We also have Dr. G. Derek Musgrove. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he's co-author of Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, and he has brought along a few books to sell today that he will stick around and autograph for you. And last but not least, our moderator for this afternoon is Dr. Bernard Demchuk. He's a retired administrator and professor from the George Washington University. And most importantly, he is the official historian for the famous Ben's Chili Bowl.
Hey.
Please help me welcome our panel this afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Am I okay? Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me? Of all the titles, I love the historian of Ben's Chili Bowl. And on August 22nd this year will be our 60th anniversary on U Street. So you all come at 12 noon. We'll have the Chuck Brown Band blasting from in front of Ben's. We'll have a big party on U Street, August 22nd. So welcome and thank you. While you're here, rather than being out there in that beautiful sunshine, you know, it's beyond me, but I'm so happy that you're here. And we're going to have a good conversation. It's 1968, and I call it the year that changed the world. Not just America, but remember the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, which one could argue was the beginning of the downfall of the Soviet Union. After Prague then became Ukraine, and then Poland, and then Prague again, and slowly the Soviet Union began to crumble. It was also the year that the Tet Offensive occurred, when 15,000 American boys were killed in Vietnam, more in that year than any other year. It was also the year of the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In show, which was political comedy. It was also the year that Yale was forced finally to admit women into undergraduate school. It was also the year of the beginning of the burning of draft cards. It was the year of the Memphis sanitation workers strike that led directly to the assassination of Dr. King. But before that, it was the beginning of the Poor People's Campaign. In late 67, early 68, the Poor People's Campaign was beginning. And it was the year that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. It was the year that the police rioted against peaceful protesters in Chicago. It was the year that women protested the American Beauty Pageant as not just bodies, but they demanded that women should have minds as well. It was the beginning of the Chicano movement, the beginning of the American Indian movement. Soul music morphs into funk. You got to bring funk in. The Afro, the Black Panther Party, and Nixon was elected. Hello, it was the year that changed the world. I end with Nixon, right? But it was also the flowering of an American culture that just exploded. Because then the button that I was wearing questioned everything. And when I came home that spring from college and I had the American flag decal upside down on my car window, my father beat my butt. Because that is what the climate was all about. It was extraordinary. But before there was 1968, there were years before. So I want to ask our panelists if they would start, not in 68, but what was it, Dr. Musgrove, and what was it, Dr. McCurder, that led us up to 68? What was America like in 64 and 65 and 67? What was going on before 68? Either of you and both of you.
That's a big question, Bernie. I mean, but I am glad that you framed it in that way because one of the things I think that happens, particularly in Washington, D.C., and particularly when we think about the assassination of King, it's as though everything was wonderful, particularly in Washington, D.C., that everything was great. I mean, even recently in a Washington Post article, there was a reference to D.C. as a colored man's paradise up to April 3rd, but then April 4 happens and then everything goes crazy. And so I like that framing and that larger context in terms of pushing us to think beyond 68. I guess if I had to think of something, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is just about the issue of police brutality. And so I think we can, it can start in, say, 1936, right, with the National Negro Congress. And when they do a study and they find that between 1925 and 1935, 40 African Americans were killed by the police, so 4 per year. We can jump to 1957 when I think it was Moultrie, who was head of the DC chapter of the NAACP, also addresses the issue of police brutality again, because in 1956, I think within like a couple of weeks of one another, 2 individuals are murdered by the police. The following year, a woman named Miss Price goes into a club, gets kicked out, and a white police officer beats her with a nightstick. So I think in some ways, those are, I think, important things about framing 1968.
I would like to say the same thing, but I'm going to say it differently.
Okay.
First off, thank you everyone for coming out on probably the second best picnic day of the season. It's nice that you come in here and talk about this terribly important event. And just to capitalize on what Dr. McWhorter said, I think there is this notion that there is a relatively robust cross-class African-American community that is a relatively nice place to be in Washington, D.C. up until April 3rd. And that really doesn't tell you how dynamic the Black community is in Washington, D.C. Prior to the riot. Chris, my co-author, Chris Myers-Ash, and I just wrote an article called "The Origins of East of the River," and it'll help you help me to explain what I'm trying to talk about here. In the decade before the riot, what we know of as East of the River, which is a predominantly black, poor section of the city that is largely neglected by city authorities and the federal government, is essentially created. In other words, black communities are being turned into ghettos in ways they really hadn't been before in the years prior to the riot. And the riots are a reaction to that process. Let me tell you what I mean. When you look at, and I'll stick with East of the River because there was rioting on St. Nicholas Avenue, now Martin Luther King Avenue, and we should be conscious of that since we typically focus on 14th Street. If you went to Southeast DC or far Northeast DC, any place east of the river in the early 1950s, you see nothing but white people. It was 85% white, mixed income community, primarily working class. Black folks were relegated to the Berry Farm Housing Project, a couple of houses around it, which used to be called Hillsdale, and to Deanwood. Those are the two black communities east of the river, right? Every place else is white. Then Southwest is destroyed in urban renewal. You all know Southwest. It's all beautiful mid-century housing that's right on the other side of the highway. Looks like it was all built at once, roughly about 50, 60 years ago, because it was, right? And it used to be a mixed income, primarily African-American, about 75% black community. And the federal government came in there and said, it's blighted. Let's destroy it and replace it. And we'll just happen to build the vast majority of the houses for people who are mid-level bureaucrats in the federal government so they can walk to work. And who cares where those people go? Now, half of them, roughly 13,000 people, went straight to Southeast. The other half, probably about a quarter to a third, went over towards the U Street area, right? And what happens is that, and they all move in about 52 to 54. They crowd these areas out, right? Housing stock deteriorates. Landlords, the vast majority of whom are white, really don't do much as far as upkeep. And you start to get a really nasty ghetto forming in what were relatively nice African-American communities that were hemmed in by segregation and weren't as nice as the white communities around them, but weren't deteriorating rapidly. And after 54, you start to see them deteriorating rapidly, right? You add on to that pretty significant police brutality. It's already been talked about. And I really encourage everyone to check out Haynes Johnson's Dusk at the Mountain. It's a great book that came out in 1963, and it's probably the best distillation of sort of what life was like in the ghetto. Officers on patrol use the N-word freely. And all the stores had a markup. Today we call it the black tax or the ghetto tax, right? But they all had a markup. And their basic argument is, I got to deal with more crime. I got to deal with a hostile clientele, so I'm going to charge all of you more, right? If you called up and asked for an apartment in the neighborhoods on the edge of these black communities that were in transition, there's actually a guy that Haynes Johnson's talked to. He says, my wife, you know, she's kind of got a white voice for work, right? And she called up and she's like, how much is the apartment? And the person gave her a certain price. It was relatively good, even with the prices around the city. He calls up. He does not have a white voice for work. He asks for a price, and the price is significantly higher. And so you have deteriorating communities where people are being charged more for those deteriorating communities, right? And so in the midst of all of this, all you needed was a match. And throughout 1967, little tiny riots were popping up all over the city, right? I mean, the police were scared, right? And, you know, this was literally, the Washington Post said this happened roughly once a week, right? That you'd have a disturbance that required police backup that could turn into a riot if it got a little crazy. And so when 1968 came around, nobody should have been surprised.
So your term, urban renewal, begs the question, and either of you on this, please. Reverend Walter Fauntleroy called it Negro removal. Mm-hmm. What does Negro removal mean in relation to urban renewal? And I thought that DC really began to desegregate in the early 50s, mm-hmm. and the black professional class moved out. And where did they go? And what was left behind?
Well, one of the things that I would say about that is, yeah, I mean, you know, Walter Fauntleroy, he was one of a number of people who called what happened in Southwest Negro removal. I mean, that was very common. And actually, in the Shaw, what's now we know as the Shaw area, the larger U Street era, there was actually an urban renewal program that had started in 1966. And so what was evermost in their minds was, well, we're not going to be Southwest. So what happened in Southwest will not happen here. And they were very, very conscious of that. And so it was the organization MECO, Model Inner City Community Organization, that was kind of an umbrella organization for a whole range of different individuals and organizations who were fighting hard to have urban renewal reflect the desires of individuals, desires of African Americans. And so that was very key. And another reason why that's important as well, I mean, Derek talked about east of the river. What I've read in terms of the Washington Post and the Evening Star is that actually between 66 and 68, and even including the Northwest 1 area, which was also under urban renewal off of North Capitol Street, that there were buildings that were already boarded up, buildings that had already been demolished before 1968. Yeah. And so that's important because, again, you read things in the Washington Post and you read things in the Evening Star. Again, it's as though everything was pristine, everything was gorgeous, but then 68 comes and then Washingtonians destroy the city. But that's not the story.
And Foggy Bottom was majority black between 1850 and 1970. Go through Foggy Bottom today. I know that there are probably 3 remaining black families in Foggy Bottom, but it was majority African American. Where did they go? So the question is, where did they go once they left, and did they go into this iconic ghetto that was then where they could go? Mm-hmm. Talk about the police. If I recall, the police are 80% white, living in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. Yeah. City is 72% black. Tell us about that dynamic.
Well, what you want to go there?
Well, yeah. So I'll try to do it within the story. And I should point out the one thing I didn't mention a moment ago was also the highways. Yeah. We tend to think of urban renewal and highways separately, but we have to remember that the city was, at the time that the riot began, had boarded up houses in Lower Shaw and had been plowing 395 slowly northward with the intention of running it dead through the middle of the African American community and displacing a projected 30,000 people. At the very time, as Maria points out, that folks were saying, we are not going to be another Southwest. And the city said, yes, Congress, I should say, says, yes, you are. And they said, we are not. And Congress says, yes, you are. And then folks riot. And we wonder why, right? But aside from that, one of the things that that Sherwood and Jaffe point out in Dream City, which is the book that I think most people tend to read when they first get to the city, or if they've been here since it came out in the mid '90s. They note that Marion Barry is arrested for jaywalking on U Street in 1967. In
front of Ben's Chili Bowl.
Yes, and they argued that it was kind of that he used it sort of cynically, right? That he kind of jumped out there, flipped off a cop, and then the cops arrest him, and he kind of fights them, and then they throw him in jail. They didn't even rough him up, and it's sort of Barry being dishonest, right? And the problem with that framing, independent of Barry's actions, is that was a regular occurrence, and it was. And a more sympathetic understanding of what happened to the folks who get caught jaywalking is appropriate. Right after the '68 riot, just a couple months later, a guy is shot for jaywalking in the middle of U Street. And there's jaywalk protests that lead to a mini riot. I think it's October of '68,
yeah, October,
right?
Elijah Bennett.
And so, here you have situations where, that scenario that Barry, being a brilliant political mind, you sort of uses it to bring to what people at the time called heighten the contradictions. Whose phone is that, for goodness sake? But Barry was attempting to heighten the contradictions. I'm just messing with you.
It's nice music. You haven't got John Coltrane? You got any John?
But the problem with just saying, well, that's just Barry being Barry, is that what he was really doing was dramatizing something that was happening to people on a regular basis on U Street, dead in the middle of U Street. And we have to remember that in 1967, this city had been majority black for 10 years. It was the blackest large majority black city in the country. I mean, we're talking well over 60% at this point, right? And here you have a situation where the cops are 85% white, say the N-word on a regular basis, people are potentially getting shot for jaywalking, and black folks are the majority. I mean, it's just such an insufferable situation. And one of the reasons that you have so much, I think, frustration about it is that there's absolutely no outlet. Remember, nobody even votes for dog catcher in DC in '68, right? We don't even get the school board until the end of the month after the riot. Right? And so the first elected office in 100 years, which doesn't control the police, comes approximately 3 weeks too late, right? And so you have a situation in which, all of these little factors can just set people off, and they do.
And I want to piggyback on that too, because even though we have some semblance of home rule, we do have a mayor commissioner and we do have a city council. It's also, Mayor Walter Washington is the mayor commissioner. There's also Thomas Fletcher, who's white, who's the deputy mayor. There's a 9-member city council, majority black, but it's John Heckinger, who's a white businessman, who's the owner. You know what I mean? So, you've got the Washington Post, you've got the Evening Star, even the Washingtonian magazine that starts in 1965. These are white-owned, white-centered media. You know what I mean? And so it's easy in one way to see, okay, well, this is a black city. Eventually it would lead to Chocolate City. Black folks were in control. In a lot of ways, though, white folks still had a lot of the power and a lot of the control. And another thing I wanted to just mention really quickly, I actually do have a personal story. When I was doing research in the Washington Post, one of my fathers, Scott McWhirter, there was an article about him and his arrest in 1960. He was arrested by a white police officer, Officer McFadden. He was actually at Columbia Heights, probably right around where Target is now. He was talking with a friend, and this white police officer comes up to him and for some reason tells them to move along. His friend moves along quickly. Apparently my father hadn't finished smoking a cigarette and he wanted to do so. And then he was arrested and thrown into a car, and apparently the officer was verbally abusive to him. But what my father did, though, is he sued. He sued the police officer. He didn't end up winning, but he sued. 2 years later, it was, it was resolved. So again, 68, 67, we can keep going back. There are these continual stories of just white police officers just feeling they can do whatever.
And we have to go back and we have to talk about 64 in LA. We have to talk about 65 with Cleveland and Milwaukee and Watts, and 67 Detroit, and 67 Cambridge, Maryland, closer to home. Cambridge, Maryland was July 23rd. It exploded, burned down, and then Newark, and then a couple days later, Detroit. 43 people killed in Detroit. Everyone started with police brutality. Everyone was the spark of police brutality that created those rebellions. Now, I just said the word rebellion. I didn't say the word riot. Was it a riot? Was it a rebellion? Was it an uprising? I'm talking about all of those periods, those motions, those times, and also DC. Is it a riot or a rebellion or an uprising, or is it a combination of both?
Well, Derek and I have talked about it. I actually used to say the riot. That's what I used to say with the air quotes. And then about a year ago, I just said, you know what? I'm just going to say uprising, and really more so as a provocation, because there is historians, scholars are kind of trying to determine, is it a riot, a rebellion, an uprising, a civil disorder, civil unrest. But I decided I'm just going to use uprising, not necessarily because I've done research around it, but I think, again, it's important just to push back on what I call just a general hyper-focus on the riot. I think the person, Samuel Walker, who just wrote the book, 14th Street is Gone, he has determined that it is, technically a riot. I don't necessarily get so much into what the terminology is. And I actually heard him speak recently at the Wilson Center. And one of the things that he mentioned and he talked about was really this sense of, he said there were about 20,000 people who were involved in the uprising in some way. And one of the things I think is, and talking about the Black community in a way, but I think it's important also to recognize that there were 20,000 people, and for some people, maybe some people thought in their head they were rioting or they were looting. Maybe just people saw an opportunity, they took some things. Like everybody who was engaged in some way, I don't think we should necessarily see them in the same way. They shouldn't necessarily be seen in the same way. People some people threw Molotov cocktails, some people just took things out of stores. There were a range of different range of different actors, you know, and motivations around it. And one of the things I think is interesting too, is even drilling down a little more. I've heard, is it a riot or is it riots? And to me, in some ways, that's even more interesting. And I haven't really thought that much more about like what that means, but I also think that's just really interesting in terms of, is it a singular thing? Is it a plural thing? I think there's something there.
Derek, riot, rebellion, or uprising? And I have, before you answer that question, Dr. Thompson, how much time do we have? When do we have to shut down? Well, the reason is 30, only 30 minutes. And the reason is because I want to hear what they have to say as well. So question, riot, rebellion, or uprising, and why?
So I like to run the numbers in order to answer the question, right? Among the Black community in Washington, D.C., who are 99% of the folks who are involved in the disturbance, you have about only 4% who engage, who physically engage, go out in the streets, loot, break windows and stuff. So you're talking about a very small number of people. Among those people, we have documented cases of people who want it to be an uprising or a rebellion. Among them are Stokely Carmichael, who talks about that. Among them are a group of people called the Zulus, who did an interview with the Washington Post for 10 blocks from the White House, which I still think is a definitive book on the riot. And they, you know, they drove around sort of throwing Molotov cocktails in the building, sort of hoping to create an uprising, right? And then we
so that's not a riot.
That's an uprising. That's
a conscious political act.
That is their intention for the violence.
Go ahead.
And they are a tiny group of people. And then you have the vast majority of people who go out there, and a lot of them give interviews. I mean, you know, it's a pretty festive atmosphere on the streets in certain cases. And, you know, and some of those people say, like, this is an uprising, like, I'm getting payback, right? And then you have people like Rosa Lee, who Leon Dash wrote a wonderful book about this woman and her family. Who's from the Washington Post. She said, man, we went out there to get clothes. And, you know, on the last anniversary of the riot, you had people calling in to you know, 93.9 saying, yeah, it was the best dressed summer in DC after the riot, right? And so I think that we have to admit that there are a lot of different people out there trying to do different things. And the folks who are the folks who are trying to turn it into a rebellion are too small and are unsuccessful. And so I still call it a riot.
So I'm going to push back on both of you, because I don't want to hear the word riot until you talk about what we did to the Native Americans for 100 years. So you talk about what we did to the Catholics, and particularly the Irish, until we talk about the slave codes and the auction blocks, until we talk about Fort Pillow and the black troops that were murdered in the Civil War, until we talk about lynching from 1873 to 1940, until we talk about Selma and Birmingham, the Colfax riot, the Vicksburg riot, the Wilmington riot, in 1898, the Red Summer of 1919, the Tulsa riot of 1923, the Rosewood riot of 1923, and the Detroit riot of 1943. What I'm doing is I'm framing that these were all white attacks on black people. Until we use the word riot, because riot means black, thug means black, middle class means white. When we say middle class, well, these are terms, and I am refusing to use the word riot until we talk about all of these other tens of thousands of people who were killed by white people. That was a riot as well. Please, disagree with me. Argue against me.
Oh, no. So what I will say is for you know, there are instances in the city's history where there are straight up rebellions. You know, if you talk specifically about a Native American rebellion, because you started off with those examples, you know, the Powhatan kill about a quarter of the white people in the entire Chesapeake region in a rebellion in 1622, I think it is, right? Organized by Powhatan's younger brother. I can never say his name right. And you know, there is in the 1919 riot, which is essentially a white service member led attack on the black community, where black folks go to Baltimore, get guns, and then defend the community and actually give as good as they get, right? And that's, you know, and so that's called a riot, but it's really a race war, right? I think what makes 1968 distinct is that there's very little fighting in the streets. One of the biggest reasons is because the white community is by and large removed from the black community, right? I mentioned that circumstances were deteriorating in the black community in DC. And one of the reasons is because all the money had left the city, at least the majority of the money, right? And that's because white people moved out roughly after desegregation, right? I mean, and by the time you get to 1968, there basically is no white working class in DC, except for a couple of holdouts east of the river who just don't have the money to move. And even they move in roughly the 5 years afterwards, right? So there's no opportunity for interracial violence like there is in Detroit, where you have 43 dead. In DC, you have 13 dead. And of that 13, I think 9 die from fire in stores. 2 were shot by police. And so when you look at that situation, you think, okay, this is fundamentally different than what happened in 1919, and we have to acknowledge that, right? And this is primarily an uprising against the cops and the stores and the landlords, and that, I think, is, you know, so we want to find a language for describing that, I think, that doesn't do the type of ideological work that you're talking about, but at the same time, folks are looting, and we should acknowledge as much. So they have a reason to, by the way.
So let's go to the night of April 4th. You have to excuse us, by the way. Historians, you ask a historian a simple question, it takes them about 300 years to answer. We have to go way back.
But Bernie, I want to follow up on that, because I think you do have a point, but I think maybe the thing is that it's not necessarily resting around whether you call it riot or urban rebellion or uprising, but maybe it's a larger issue around violence. And to me, I think you might have something there, because part of one of the things that I argue is that around 68, in some ways, violence becomes black. Like it in some ways is displaced from white bodies onto black bodies. And I think what happens is, you know, obviously King is assassinated by, well, we're told by James Earl Ray, but we know that. I mean, I don't know, but that's what we're told. I'm not saying there was a conspiracy.
I'll put that case on him.
I'm not saying it was a computer. I'm just saying that's what we're told, and that. But we also know that King and others were viciously surveilled by the FBI, right? And so what you hear is, particularly in things like places like the Washington Post and New York Times and other places, you'll hear, okay, yeah, King was assassinated, but the violence was here, right? And so they're kind of disassociating the violence of what Ray did and the violence of the FBI, and then, but no, the violence is here. So I think what you're arguing is, and kind of what King and others have said what King said in New York when he was talking about the Vietnam War, he was saying, well, if I have to talk about the violence in the quote unquote ghettos, I can't do that unless I also say that the U.S. is the largest purveyor of violence in the world. So I think if you put it in the context of violence and where violence gets placed, I think you have an argument.
That's exactly where I'm going. And Dr. King said when the bombs are being dropped in Vietnam, they're exploding in the streets of Detroit. Yeah. And where are we putting our money? Where are we putting our resources? So let's go to D.C. Let's go to April the 3rd. Dr. King gives the Mountaintop speech in Memphis. And by the way, keep rereading. Every time I reread, Birmingham Jail or Mountaintop or the Riverside Church speech, I mean, it's extraordinary how deep this guy was and how broad his intellect was.
Or also, if I can interject really quickly, or Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, which he did on March 31st here at the National Capitol.
Extraordinary stuff.
Which is available via YouTube.
So he gives the Mountaintop speech, and he indicates that this might be his last breath. It's extraordinary that he knew that. And then he gets shot at 6:05. He is pronounced dead, or as we would like to say, joins the ancestors at 7:05. What happened in Washington, D.C.? I am told, I was in SNCC in 64, 65, 66. SNCC's headquarters was across the street from Ben's Chili Bowl. I was told that Stokely was at Howard's campus at that time and led some kind of motion going down Georgia Avenue. Can you tell us what happened that evening on April 4th in D.C.? In D.C.
Sure. I mean, so Stokely Carmichael, for those of you who are familiar, was the recent past chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the most dynamic youth civil rights organization in the Southern movement. And he had recently relocated to Washington, D.C., where he organized a group called the Black United Front. And it was a broad coalition of pretty much every African-American political group in the city, all the way from the very conservative Urban League over to some pretty radical groups, some of which you might have heard of, others of which you haven't. And the idea was that you take this massive African-American population, which still does not have the vote, and you mobilize it to get the vote here in the nation's capital. And so he had gone out of the country and then come back, and he was here, and he heard about the news. He had just met with Dr. King a month or two before at the Pitts Motor Hotel on Belmont Street, Belmont and 15th. It's now a condo. And he had a good working relationship with him, even though they had agreed on a lot of issues. They believed they differed in strategy. And he was beside himself. I mean, he was just beside himself. So he headed out onto U Street, sort of came down 14th and headed onto U Street, demanding that all of the store owners on U Street close in honor of King. And the idea was, y'all closed in honor of President Kennedy in 1963. You need to close in honor of King here in 1968. And most did, like straight away, right? If for no other reason that they were scared, because he had a lot of people standing behind him. And he's going up and down the street, and he and Walter Fauntroy talk at one point, and Walter Fauntroy is worried that things are going to break out. And Stokely Carmichael is like, dude, I'm just getting stores to close. That's it, because that was really his intention. But then the crowd behind him got out of control, and worried that he would get implicated in what was becoming very quickly a civil disturbance that was moving beyond his ability to control. He got out of there. There was an effort, largely because he had also gone to Baltimore. He goes to Baltimore not long after, and then there's an uprising in Baltimore as well. The FBI tried for days. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover obsesses about this, trying to make the case that Stokely Carmichael is literally going around starting riots. The problem was he'd only been in 2 cities, and there are civil disturbances of varying size in more than 120 around the country. And so, unless he cloned himself up really quickly and got some plane tickets, it wasn't going to happen. But they obsessed over it. And so that's where Stokely was. But very quickly things got out of hand. And you have to remember that 14th and U was not just sort of a crossroads of the African American community, it's also a transit hub. And so the number of people moving through there, loitering on the streets, talking to each other. You have to remember there's a large number of apartment buildings going up 14th especially. So there's a lot of people on the street. Very quickly things, got violent. And Carmichael was gone.
So Maria, speak to that if you like. But Dr. King did say, he used the word riot. He said a riot is the voice of the unheard. So people said they wanted to be heard. And so they threw a brick through People's Drugstore window. Mm-hmm. That was the voice, the brick. Go ahead.
I only hesitate because I don't know how many of you know, but Sharita mentioned it. I'm the curator of the DC 1968 project, and I actually started my project again because of the hyper focus on the uprising. And so most of my research has been not about the uprising. Mm-hmm. So I am in no sense, an expert on it at all. But I've done some, reading about it, so I'm in no sense an expert. But I think one of the things that's also important to think about 14th and U, and also this notion of the Black community, which is something I've been thinking about as well, is that really what does constitute a Black community, particularly when you think about an uprising. So, for example, you hear all the time, well, why would somebody destroy their own community? Why would someone destroy their own neighborhood? And what I think it's important for people to recognize that, in fact, and this has historically been the case, that many, if not most, I'd say at least, of the businesses on U Street were white-owned. Many of the businesses on 14th Street were white-owned, and Derek alluded to earlier about the price gouging and those kinds of things. We think about the Lincoln Theater, that was always white-owned. The Howard Theater was always white-owned. The Republic Theater, you know what I mean? And so I think that's another thing that's important for people to think about, is in terms of why people would destroy their own community, because particularly for people maybe who were poor and working class, that they didn't think of it as own. They rented. They didn't necessarily have feel that they had a stake in some ways in terms of where they lived. But maybe that was a little different for people who were middle class and who owned businesses. But let me just say really quickly though, I think what's also important is that 14th and U was also a hub. You had the SCLC office, you had the SNCC office, you also had the new Poor People's Campaign. You had the New School of Afro-American Thought.
Drummond Spear Bookstore.
Well, Drummond Spear came in June of '68. Right. That came after. Right. So at the same time, it was kind of this cultural, intellectual kind of Pan-African hub that was also developing, at the same time. So yeah, just 14th and U, just an era is just really fraught historically. Just kind of
but let me emphasize the culture. So we've now moved from I was removed, quote unquote, from SNCC in '66 because all the whites had to leave because it became a Black Power organization. So now the rise of the Black Panther Party, I mentioned the Afro, I mentioned the clothing, all of that becomes a cultural statement that we are not going to take it anymore. And some of those businesses that were white would not hire African Americans as employees. And they became a severe target that if you're going to take our money and run out to Rockville or Silver Spring and not hire us, we're going to burn you down. And so there was a whole there was a very tough Black consciousness that had arisen just at that moment.
If I could, so let me give a number, and then let me sort of throw a wrench in part of the narrative that we're building here. I mean, so when it comes to businesses in the riot corridors, and so you're talking about 14th U, 7th H, and then St. Nicholas Road. 86% of the businesses burned in those areas were white-owned. That shows two things. I mean, one is it shows a bit of intentionality on the part of the rioters, which is that they are skipping businesses that scrawl Soul Brother in paint in a soap on the front windows, in a lot of cases, not in all cases.
But what happened?
Because Riot doesn't discriminate.
But fire riots.
Yes.
The fire riots.
Yes. Yes.
It jumps.
Yes. Yes. Fires don't discriminate.
And especially when the fire trucks say, "I ain't going down there."
Right. But what it also points out is I think what Maria was pointing out, which is that there is a large number of white businesses in these areas, right? And so when you add the two together, you get those numbers. The other thing I think we have to point out, though, is that, the violence that occurs when you have structural inequality like this, in many ways, doesn't discriminate, right? And so there are a number of white store owners who are fair to their Black customers, who have good relationships with their Black employees, and who just get caught up. I mean, there's people like John Heckinger, who is appointed, as a council chairman, but honestly wants to figure out how to make the city work for its residents. And he is hamstrung by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and the fact that we don't have a government beyond the appointed council and the mayor, and so Congress still runs the place. He's got people like Robert Byrd, senator from West Virginia, who's determined to make sure that people on welfare in D.C. can barely scrape by if they're not starving. He's got people like John McMillan, who's the chair of the D.C. committee in the House, sort of Byrd's counterpart, who's determined to make sure that he can go back to his voters in South Carolina and say, see, I didn't give those niggers a dime, right? That's his campaign promise, right? And hey, by the way, would you like a job as the police officer in Washington, D.C., right? And so, someone like Heckinger is caught in the middle, right, between, a justifiable Black rage and segregationists trying to hold out until their last breath. And and King was really this sort of glue that kept a lot of things from exploding. He was also depressed for the last 2 years of his life because he knew he couldn't play that role indefinitely, right? So when things broke, when things fell apart, you had a lot of well-intentioned people in the middle who got hurt.
That's true. And we should also try to push against a little bit this Black-white dyad as well, because there were, not as much as other places, but there were Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, who were in the area. And if you haven't seen, there's a wonderful documentary, I think it's called Chinatown, or April 1968, that looks at the Chinese Americans who were in the city, and particularly the ones who owned businesses, and how they were in some ways kind of caught in the middle.
Yeah.
But I recently met last week a gentleman whose father-in-law owned a soul food carryout right around 14th and U, and he was Chinese American, which I think is interesting.
And agreed to your point, Derek. I mean, many of the white businesses were Jewish, and the Jewish people always had a strong sense of their own oppression, and they certainly took the side of African Americans much more frequently than what is noted. So the rebellion occurs. It goes on for 3 days, 4 days, a lot of destruction. There was a credit. There was a curfew, but there was a credit to Mayor Washington, who said that we will not shoot looters.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, we are the only city in the country that did not shoot looters as a police force. Things end in about 4 days, and there's a response. There's a police response, there's a city response,
Mm-hmm.
there's a federal government response. Mm-hmm. What is the response after 68?
I'm going to let you take this one.
Okay. So, the first response, I think, is one of the most important, and that is that on April 5th, city leaders, appointed members of the council, but also a couple of the more moderate civil rights leaders, go and meet with the president and several members of Congress. And in that meeting, April 5th, President Johnson says, y'all got to get the housing bill out of committee and get it to my desk. And so Dr. King's assassination and the riot in particular, the DC riot in particular, really forces the Fair Housing Act out of the Congress, where a conservative coalition of Republicans and Democrats had determined to make sure that it did not move, right? Mm-hmm. We think about this Congress as a very liberal Congress that passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but then we have the elections of 1966, and Congress gets dominated by a bipartisan coalition of people who are determined to end reform. And they do nasty stuff. Like, there's a bill up in 1966 for rat abatement in the cities. Yeah. And DC had a horrible rat problem, especially in the African American community. So it was so bad that Julius Hobson, the famed leader of CORE, trapped a whole bunch of rats in Shaw, strapped them to the top of his car and said, I'm going to let them out in Georgetown if y'all don't start killing rats in Shaw, right? It got so bad that Pride, Marion Barry's organization, actually broke into the storage facility where the city was keeping rat poison, broke in, mixed the poison themselves, and went and started killing rats themselves, and the city was being too slow about doing it, right? This is 1967 when they did that. So rats are horrible here. And what does Congress do? The money's up to get more money for cities around the country for rat abatement. And members of this conservative coalition say that's a civil rights bill, and we are not going to vote for it, and they vote it down, right? And so this callousness, right? And so the moment the riot happens, Johnson says, "Get that damn bill on my desk," right? And they do, right? So the first reform of the riots is fair housing. After that, though, you see the Black United Front, Stokely Carmichael's organization, doing a survey all around Shaw about police brutality. The federal government responds again. You get the pilot police precinct, which is essentially an effort to create community control of the police, really in response to the BUF's activities that summer and the riot the spring before, right? And so you get police reform, right? And the number of black cops in DC goes up very quickly. You go from about a quarter of the force to within about 5 years, I think half of the force.
And lieutenants and captains and commanders, it keeps going on, and women. All of that is good. So you just made my argument, Dr. Musgrove. So in 1964,
trap.
I trapped you. So in 1964, because the white people rioted in Mississippi against the SNCC organizers, and we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And in 1965, they rioted against the Selma organizers, and now we get the 1965 Act. And in 1968, 120 cities explode, and now we get the Fair Housing Act. So riots are good.
I don't think they are uniformly bad.
Oh.
Look, after the Baltimore uprising, Ta-Nehisi Coates put out an article, and he said, look, riots are dangerous. They have unintended political consequences, and they also sometimes lead to the reforms that people in the streets were calling for.
Listen,
right?
I'm not romanticizing. You are exactly right. But I'll tell you what, every police force in America now is looking at Baltimore and Ferguson and trying to figure out how can they begin to make their police force look like their community rather than face another Baltimore or Ferguson because of these kinds of rebellions.
But I mean, I think the thing though is I think part of it is what's the end goal? You know, so I think, for example, if your end goal is the Fair Housing Act, then it can be successful. But if your end goal is revolution, or if your end goal is the abolition of the police force, or if your end goal is to have the majority of the population engaged in continuous organizing and activism, then, you know, then whether it's a success or not. But I actually don't think it's important to think about whether, I was actually reading about this, about the notion of whether or not it was successful, whether it succeeded or failed. There's actually, I was reading Gordon Mantler's book about the Poor People's Campaign, and he says that scholars have really focused on, trying to decide whether it was a success or a failure, and have determined that it was a failure. But I think in some ways, the very fact that it existed, the desire to organize poor people across race, across class, across ethnicity, and across gender, and they were able to have those conversations. The Resurrection City did happen for six weeks. So I think, I don't think we should necessarily think about it in terms of success and failure or its effectiveness. I mean, for me, I think what's most important is people becoming educated, people organizing, and people being committed to activism. To me, that's the most important. And so that's what I would see as something that needs to kind of continue to happen.
Go ahead.
Can I draw on that? Because, Marie and I had a great conversation about this a couple of days ago. You know, the way that we tend to measure the effects of the riot is we look at buildings.
Yeah.
And the riot was hell on buildings, right? In the riot corridor, you had one of the highest incidences of fires of any riot city in DC. And the riot really gutted parts of 7th, 14th, U, H, all the different places. But buildings aren't the only thing that make up a community. In fact, they're just the thing that a community uses to keep out of the rain, right? What makes up a community is people. And if you look at what happens on the ground before and after the riots, and the riot really ends up becoming a catalyst for a higher level of activism, what you see is a community that is absolutely bursting with cultural and political energy and determined to gain self-determination, to express self-love, and in its more militant manifestations to exercise self-defense, right? The three elements of Black power. And so what happens in the 10 years after the riot? You get a fully functioning city government. You get a almost successful effort to make DC what is the rough equivalent of a Black state.
Yeah.
In 1978, we passed legislation that would have given DC 2 senators and a voting member of Congress. That's effectively a Black state, right?
And in that process, we become known as the Black Mecca of America.
Yes. Now, and I should point out, because I left it hanging there, right? Like, we actually passed all that through Congress as an amendment to the Constitution. It does not get ratified, right? Because the conservative counter-reaction becomes really quite strong and snows it under in the early 80s. But you get you get this bursting of culture on the streets of the city. So much so that Parliament Funkadelic writes a song about it and names an album after it. You've probably heard of it, Chocolate City, right? And so there's a way in which, if we measure the riot by the buildings, like, yeah, it was destructive and like end of story, right? If we measure it by what it does to the people who live through it, it's a very different story. And that hope and that promise and that success, I mean, these folks actually go from no votes to fully functioning city government, right? In 10 years, after 100 years of not having it, right? If you look at that, DC is in a remarkably hopeful moment after 1968. And that is diametrically opposed to the story that we tell if we just look at the storefronts, right?
So, perfect timing to where we're going, to what this is all about. How do we remember 68? What's memory teach us? How are we operationalizing or romanticizing or learning from 68 today? Because we are now 50 years. It's been 50 years since 68. How are we remembering it? And what are we doing with, what are we learning or not learning from 68?
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one of the things, as I said, in terms of what I'm trying to do with my project is that in some ways is trying to take us from here and bring us down in terms of on the ground, in terms of just kind of what was happening on a daily basis, you know. And so my project really has been about, you know, going through the newspapers, looking at photographs, talking to people about what was it like just on a daily basis to live in the city, to kind of give a sense of the, you know, kind of look and feel and smell of the city. And I think, and again, I think it really is, you know, I show a kind of history of organizing and activism, a focus on art, and also even about architects. I mean, that's another thing that we don't usually talk about in terms of Black architects. There was an architectural firm called 2MJQ that was formed by Howard University architects in 1966, and some other architectural firms who really saw DC in general, and particularly after the uprising, that was a moment for architects and, you know, planners and other individuals, artists, activists to really create the kind of city that they want. You know, again, you know, as Derek said, that, you know, even with people, you know, leaving the South and coming to SNCC, Marian Wright Edelman comes, you know, from SNCC, Marion Barry, Eleanor Holmes Norton, a whole litany of people, and they really see DC as a moment to kind of create a progressive Black-led city. And so, you know, these architects were, you know, kind of a part of that vision. And I think the thing is that one of the things I think is important to learn is that, you know, change is hard. You know, change is hard. Change can be messy. Organizing, you know, can be hard. And at the same time, that another thing we learn is the repression that can come, you know, as a result of, you know, a kind of organizing and an activism and a pushing. And I'm smiling because I heard Samuel Walker talk about his book, Most of 14th Street is Gone. And for him, the lesson, you know, he comes up with very different lessons in terms of the riots, in terms of, you know, he says, for example, that people rioted because there was, you know, because they were poor, or the lesson is that that if you can have police response, but it should be restrained. And to me, those aren't necessarily the lessons, you know, that should be, you know, learned from that.
No, I think that's really important because so the book that you're referring to is Most of 14th Street is Gone by J. Samuel Walker, and you know, he works primarily out of presidential libraries for that book. And so the lessons that the people who put together those archives were trying to learn is, how do we prevent this from happening? And the lesson that much of his last chapter is devoted to is what worked in DC was overwhelming force, overwhelming show of force, but without shooting people. And therefore, that's how we can keep a riot from happening in the future. And I think that's dumb. Because if you're already at the point where you're sending troops into the city, you've already lost. You're just managing the crisis, right? And so I think a better question is, you know, how do we create a just society? Which, by the way, was a question that people were asking as the riot was beginning to happen, right? Most prominent among them, Martin Luther King. And so I think one of the things... And the Kerner Commission, and half the activists in the city, right? I mean, one of the things I think that we cannot do when we remember the riot, because the process of remembering is about sort of taking something that's very big and complex and messy and sort of narrowing it down into something that's almost symbolic and totemic, right? So you say, you know, April 4th through 8th, change the city, right? And you don't talk about what led into April 4th through 8th. You don't talk about what came out of April 4th through 8th. Typically what you do is you put two pictures side by side. You know, U Street during the riot, U Street today, must be rebirthed, right? And that misses so much. In fact, it actually gives us, I think, the wrong lesson, right? And so what I think that we have to do as we remember the riot is to actually listen to the people who were on the street, who tried to rebuild. And when you incorporate their voices, you realize that the lessons are fundamentally different than some of those that you see in Walker's book, and some of those that you see in the pages of the Washington Post, which, by the way, has great coverage of '68, but covers it as, I want to talk about the violence for April 4th to 8th, and then we're pretty much done. And they got a great map, by the way, right? And so what I hear those people saying is, one, Black folks, many different classes in DC demanded a just society. And they demanded it specifically because the city had promised them a decade before that it was already here, right? We have to remember the city is desegregated by law, roughly by the mid-1950s, right? By law, like not in fact, but by law, right? And so you have Bowling v. Sharp, desegregation of schools. You have the Thompson case, which brings back the lost laws, which says that you cannot discriminate in public places. You have the Supreme Court decision in 48 that says you cannot use restrictive covenants, and so housing should be desegregated. That's 48. The Thompson case is 53. Bowling v. Sharp is 54. We should be done, y'all. Like, this should be a wrap. And here we are 14 years later, and Black folks still can't get good jobs in city government. They can't get good jobs on most of the buses in the city. People are still using restrictive covenants. The suburbs are totally off limits to them. And the cops are still screaming the N-word at them, right? And so, there's these unfulfilled expectations that you promised me a just society. We've got nothing of the sort. And so there is the rage, right? Those same people on the back end of the riot tried to create a just city from the ashes, right? They tried to build Black businesses in the riot corridors. They tried to create a city government that would actually serve the majority of the residents. They were hampered by the fact that the home rule legislation created a structural deficit, and so they were always short on money. They were hampered by the fact that the Reconstruction Land Agency would just sit on properties and not really give, and the federal government wasn't offering them low interest loans where they could actually invest in these properties and rebuild. Most of the people who had money had fled the city and headed out to Silver Spring and other places, and so that money was gone. And so here they are, a bunch of poor people essentially trying to figure out how to rebuild a city, right, on egalitarian lines. Congress is still nipping at their heels, still for a couple of years after the riot, trying to drive highways through the city. And they made valiant efforts, and through those valiant efforts actually showed us how this might be possible, but were ultimately undermined by their fellow Americans.
So let us not forget. So the Great Society actually began to benefit all through the 70s, and Reagan comes.
Yes.
With Reagan, we get Reaganomics, we get the pullback from the programs going into urban centers and the extremely high increase in military spending, and we get Reaganomics, and the Bronx goes down, Brooklyn goes down, South Central goes down, and what comes in? Crack cocaine.
Yes.
And where does crack cocaine come from, and how did it get here? And so this, no, but I raised the question. I don't necessarily want you to answer because you're on tape. but it becomes a real question. What happened in 60s and 70s? We began to flower. There was a cultural explosion. It was a good thing. And now all of a sudden we get Reaganomics, and we have no more monies for our urban centers, for education, for housing, for health care. And that begins to reverse those trends, and we all start to go downhill.
Well, this is the paradox of the riots, right? Which is that in order to gain control, to try and build a more egalitarian city, you had to have this violence, right? I mean, that's the way you create empty storefronts where you hope to put a Black business, right? That are not competing with better capitalized white competitors, right? That violence creates a Fair Housing Act, right? By forcing Congress to back off of its stand, right? The sort of political awakening that the riot helps allows someone like Walter Fontre to get busloads of DC residents, send them down to South Carolina's 6th congressional district, and figure out how to beat John McMillan, who was the major bulwark to home rule legislation in the House. They do it in 72, and then they get Charlie Diggs in there, and he helps write home rule legislation, African-American congressman from Detroit. And so, all of these things are a product of the riot, but at the same time, the riot does cause capital flight. It does make it nervous and make it scary, even for Black middle class people to build businesses. There's, I'll tell you one quick story. There's in 1970, there is a riot on 14th Street, 2 years after the 68 riot. And that riot, by and large, is a product. It starts right at 14th and Fairmont because the police do a drug raid on the building. Oddly enough, the landlord for Fairmont, the building there, was the city. and they had basically run it as slum housing. Then the cops do a drug raid on it, and folks just go nuts. They start pelting the cops with bottles and rocks and stuff. And it sort of opens up into a full-scale, moderate-sized riot on the corridor for roughly 2 nights. The people who actually try to bring control of the area again are Marion Barry and the owner of the Pitts Motor Hotel, Leonard Pitts. Why am I messing up his first name?
Yeah. Pitts,
last name is Pitts. But they're local Black activists, right? I point all that out to say that the businesses that get hurt most by that riot are the Black businesses that had come in and had been able to fill in some of those empty storefronts, right? And so here you see the price, right? Like you have the '68 riot, it opens up space for these Black businesses. The federal government is actually a little shook up by the riot, so it gives them loans. For the first time, a lot of white banks weren't giving them any money in that entire area, right? So they get the loans through they get the access to the storefronts, but the riot also set off this instability in the neighborhood, right? That sometimes reemerged as another riot, and then their businesses get burned, right? And so you have a situation where the price of the ticket is exceedingly high, right? And it's very difficult for folks on the ground with very few resources to be able to pay that and still build a just society on the ashes. They're not able to, even though they try valiantly.
I'm going to say, I think one of the things too, in terms of the lessons too, I think also is also how we frame this, because one of the things we mentioned in terms of the Congress, kind of pushing back, and LBJ doing yes, let's go forward, and let's not. I think also we also have to think about the history and the continued presence of structural racism, and white supremacy. Like, why didn't those committee members, want to do right by Washington, D.C.? Because it's majority Black. You know what I mean? So I think that's a lesson. And that, even in the Kerner Commission, I mean, it says it's a couple 100-page report, and they zero down, I think on page 1 or 2, the cause of the riot is white racism. I mean, they say this, back in '68. And so I think that's another thing that we, in terms of a lesson that we have to always, hold on to, is this persistent presence of racism and white supremacy, and white people's investment in the continuance of racism and white supremacy. I mean, the poet Claudine Rankin was on a panel with the New Yorker editor, David Remnick. And she said, we were talking, with all this whole thing about number 45 and where we are. And she said to him, well, where were you 5 years ago? Where were you 10 years ago when, with Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives and a whole host of other things, or people who, who are immigrants, and, where were you then? It was only when, Trump comes in with, with his white mediocrity and his white inhumanity, that some white folks started to wake up. So I think that persistence is something that we also have to hold as a lesson.
So we're gonna go to you and ask you to stand up and ask a couple questions, and I can repeat the question for the.
No, I have a microphone.
Oh, you have a mic.
So I have a microphone if you have a
Before we
question.
go there, Dr. Thompson, before we go there, I want to ask one quick question. The Black liberation movement of the 50s and 60s was not just a Black movement. Coming out of that, flowering out of that, is the women's movement, is the Chicano movement, is the gay lesbian movement, is the people with disabilities movement, is the environmental movement. Speak to us that this is not just a Black-white binary, this is a flowering of so many other things that we are now the beneficiaries of today.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so, but and also at the same time, I think when we think about kind of the Black liberation movement, we also have to think also about the intersection of race and labor, of African Americans even before the 50s. You think of A. Philip Randolph, and you think of other folks who were also very committed to labor and economic rights, even before then, going back to the 40s or 30s or 20s. So I think that's important as well.
If you go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you go to the 1968 section, there's a very, very large panel of from the Poor People's Campaign. And if you look at that panel and read it carefully, you'll see that this was a really multicultural rainbow Poor People's Campaign. There was Chicanos and Native Americans and gay people and women and this, that, and the other thing. It was a real flowering of our society.
It was a flowering, but I think also at the same time, we don't want to romanticize it, because one of the things that Gordon Mantler points out in his book in terms of the Poor People's Campaign, that King and others were challenged by, one is that they're kind of top-down patriarchal structure in terms of the SCLC, but also they said that they wanted to engage with Chicanos and Native Americans and others, but really hadn't had experience doing so.
Mhm.
And so I think we can say that we want, folks of color to come together, but there also has to be serious work around thinking about how to actually do that.
If they won't open the door, we knock it down and open it ourselves. Go ahead, Dr. Thompson. We got a
Any
microphone for questions.
Raise your
Questions
hand.
or comments.
Good, jump over here. She's coming to you.
Hi, I want to thank you for this presentation. I have a quick question. I'm thinking of today, and I'm wondering, are things better now or are they just different? Because I know Dr. Musgrove said early on, like, you throw a match into what the structural issues that existed pre-1968, it was all just ready to happen. And I think of today, things are different. Like then you had capital fleeing out of the city. Now you have capital fleeing into the city, but there's still this dramatic economic inequality that maybe is worse now than it was then. I don't know economic history of 1968. So I'm just wondering, are things better now, or is it a different kind of divide that we're dealing with now?
Man.
And by the way, thank you for that. That was going to
Yeah.
be my last question for the day. It was perfect.
So, I think a way to answer that is to talk about how they're better and how they're different, and for whom, right? So if you look at just the size of the Black middle class, it's bigger, right? And for the Black middle class, things are better. If you look at the size of the desperately Black poor, it's actually bigger. And for them, it's, rough. It's the cops aren't as brutal in certain ways, but they're much more like warriors, or an army in other ways, right? DC has been a little bit better on this than most other cities, right, as far as the militarization of its police. So it literally breaks down by class, by region. So I'd say for certain groups of people, particularly the Black middle class, it's better. You certainly have to admit that politically it's better. I mean, there's a Black elected mayor who has power to do things. She has largely walked away from the type of politics that come out of the riot, as have her three predecessors, right, going back to Anthony Williams. The idea for a lot of the people that went into the mayor's office, particularly Marion Barry, I mean, we're only talking about one person because he was the mayor 4 times, but was a Black power type of politics. And the idea was that you seize government, you then use government to transfer wealth, right? And Barry hoped to do that roughly in 2 ways. One was through minority contracting. So when he gets into office, it's a 70% Black city with only 7% of its city contracts going to minority businesses. He basically says through Courtland Cox, who's his deputy and fellow veteran of SNCC, if y'all don't get it up to 25%, everybody's getting fired, right? Mm-hmm. Being good bureaucrats, within 5 years, they got up to 35%, mm-hmm. right? And this massive transfer of wealth occurred because of that, right?
And that creates Ward 9, which we call Prince George's County.
Yes. He also hoped to increase the number of African Americans on the city payroll in order to build the Black middle class, and to improve housing. And on those, he was a bit more sketchy. He was able to sort of get a couple of good contracts for houses going, but then he realized the city didn't have that much money, and the bureaucracy, particularly the housing department, didn't do a good job of sustaining the effort. And as far as hiring people, he actually did a great job with that. The problem was that they all moved to Ward 9, and the city lost their tax dollars. And so, it's mixed. What I will say is that one of the things that his predecessors did when they walked away from that is that they had to figure out how to get the city to balance its budget. And what Anthony Williams came up with is to say, okay, the only way we can keep tax dollars in the city is if well-to-do people live here. And so he set out to attract middle-class and well-to-do people back to the city. In other words, he made gentrification the city's fiscal policy. And all of his successors have maintained that, right? And only once he realized what was happening right before he left office, did he turn around and say, oh, I got to make sure that poor people aren't displaced. And he put together a really good program. And then Adrian Fenty came in and destroyed the program. And no one's really rebuilt it since. And Muriel Bowser right now is not under pressure to do so in a serious way because she doesn't have any competition. I'd say better and worse.
Good question. Marie, you want to comment on that question?
I mean, I think Derek answered that quite well. One of the things that I will say is, I don't know if you've read the book Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr., but I think that's an important book to read, because one of the things he argues is and part of what Derek was getting to was how in a city that is majority Black, where you have the mayor, the city council, and in the 90s, a police chief who was Black, how do we get to a point where, which leads to such high mass incarceration, among Black folks. And one of the things he says is that it's important to look at the role of class, among Black folks, and that, just because someone's Black doesn't mean they're going to look out for someone else who's Black. You think of Eric Holder, who was U.S. attorney in the 1990s, and in 1995, he started a program called Operation Ceasefire, and the goal was to try to get the guns off the street. Now, when he came up with and this was a program that was kind of like pretext policing, so they could stop someone looking for guns, and if they found them, great. If they didn't, great too. But what also happened is that when they were searching a car, sometimes they might find drugs and other things, and so that person, even though they didn't have a gun, may have had drugs, and so they were arrested. And so that also flooded the jails. And obviously, if that happens, then that impacts on your ability to find a job, to keep a job, maybe to get access to public housing, and a whole bunch of other things. And he was very cognizant of the fact that by doing this, that he would, that there would be a whole range of Black folks who would be caught up in this. There's statistics that range between 1 in 20 or 1 in 100 guns will be found, through this program. And he knew very well, particularly young Black men would be implicated in this. And he was just like, oh well. And so, I think that's important, for us to think about. And so that'd be a good book for you to check out.
Question and/or comment? Where?
Hi, everyone. First, thank you very much for this talk. You just brought up a lot of really important ways we can take action in today's situation, but I kept hearing throughout this the theme about housing. It started with housing, it seems, with the displacement, ends with the Fair Housing Act. I attended a talk here a few years ago about the displacement that's happening recently in the city, and they explained that, I don't know if it's related specifically to the federal regulations or what's happened with DC specifically, but they explained that a lot of fair housing lapsed after a 30-year period, 30 or 40-year period, and so what's happening in the city is there used to be a much higher percentage of fair, equitable housing available that has just recently disappeared. And I was wondering if you could speak to what you see as sort of a good solution for DC to make it more integrated and more sort of what we would think of as an ideal. Thank you.
I can jump in. Sure.
This is the hardest nut to crack.
Yeah.
So, what's the name of Amanda's new book?
Something about
The Commons.
the Commons.
Creating the Commons.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of great research on this, and I'm gonna encourage you to check out a couple of books. One is Sabia Prince and Derek Hyra's Capital Dilemma, which is sort of a compendium of studies that focus on fair housing, a right to the city, and sort of anti-gentrification organizing. What you see right after the riot is, and this I think again contradicts that narrative that we have out there in popular descriptions of the riot, is a burst of gentrification in some of the old riot neighborhoods, where in Adams Morgan, Logan Circle, Capitol Hill, all these places that are adjacent to riot corridors, Columbia Heights, developers come in and snap up properties with the idea of flipping them. And it causes a pretty robust anti-gentrification community to organize, so that poor people can keep access to the city. Because what people are literally doing is they're buying a place, boarding it up and sitting on it, right? And in certain cases, kicking out the renters, boarding it up and sitting on it, right? Right after the riot. And so what you see is a lot of anti-gentrification activists trying to create land trusts, actually organizing low equity cooperatives, demanding that the city pass rent control, demanding that the city pass the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, all of which are really the backbone of low-income housing within the market outside of sort of federal housing and projects and stuff. And a lot of that legislation is still on the books. The question is how well people are able to use it, right? Because the benefit that a lot of people had in the late 60s, early 70s is that you had Great Society programs that offered poor people lawyers free of charge, right? And good lawyers. You actually had the city, because of these tenants' rights activists, giving what's the term? Loans where they didn't have to pay a lot of low interest loans. So that poor people who organized into a cooperative could actually buy their buildings from slumlords, right? I mean, like all of this is a product of struggle after the riot, right? And what people like Amanda Huron, whose book Creating the Commons are doing, are sort of reminding us of these really creative ways that people found to push back against discriminatory housing or exploitative housing. And those are still all applicable. The folks who are doing the 11th Street Bridge project are looking specifically at creating low equity cooperatives and a land trust for a mile around the bridge, because they know that once that bridge crosses the Anacostia, the gentrification that has taken hold in Capitol Hill, in Logan Circle, all these other places, is going to cross the river. It already has to a significant degree, right? You can see little Abdo signs everywhere, right? But they're nonetheless reaching back and looking at those ideas and trying to bring them to this current project. And the fact of the matter is that's what we have to do. And a lot of us who organized against the comprehensive plan, and I have to tip my hat to Maria for really getting us going on this. Scholars, we submitted testimony against the new comprehensive plan because it makes no account for poor people in its 10-year projection for how the city should be developed. And that's number one, particularly in a place when we're talking about issues of racial justice, where the vast majority of people on the high end of the income spectrum are white, and the vast majority of the people on the low income spectrum are black. It's not uniform, but that's the basic breakdown. And so if you preserve low income housing, you preserve housing for black people, right? And so, we need to think about that before the development, because after the development, it's too late. It's like Walker talking about how we should deal with a riot once it's already happening. It's just a done deal.
And I think another important thing about this too is one is just, I think one of the things that's happened also is that I think in '68 you could have a conversation about poverty, you could have a conversation about welfare, you could really have a conversation about poor people, and that even though it wasn't perfect, that these were conversations that were happening. There were programs in place. And what I feel now in 2018, well, you don't hear really conversations about welfare, and people in some ways don't even want to talk about poverty and poor people. But if they do, it's oftentimes more on a behavioral level as opposed to on a structural level. So I think that's one of the things that has to happen is a kind of cross-class commitment to justice, and in terms of justice for all. And one of the things that I think about too is the fact that, like, I live in the Petworth neighborhood, and that's an area that is experiencing gentrification and displacement. And one of the things that I wonder, that here is a moment in which you have, which is cross-class. You've got African Americans, you've got Latinx, you've got white folks. And in some ways, I guess there's some cross-pollination, but it really doesn't seem that way. So even within a neighborhood, you still see kind of racialized segregation in that neighborhood. But what would happen if actually people started to have conversations with each other within that neighborhood? Like, how powerful could that be? But there's this way, for a whole host of reasons, that it doesn't seem, at least in my neighborhood, where those conversations could happen. But so in my most optimistic moments, I think there's power there. But the thing is trying to figure out, how people, I guess, can come out of their houses, can kind of turn off their surveillance cameras and really have a conversation with the people who live in the neighborhood and think about, well, even on a kind of local level, what would it take if we all have a general sense of of the kind of society or the kind of neighborhood even that we want to live in, what would that look like? And have those kind of conversations really on a local level. Not to say that they're easy, they're challenging, but to me, that's really what has to happen. Because if you're not kind of invested in really seeing the people that you live next to as people that you really want to engage in, I think it makes it really challenging.
Okay,
So
so that's a wonderful way to end our program, and you can certainly stick around and talk to our panelists and have some informal conversations. My mother-in-law reminded me that I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sharita Thompson, and I co-organize and produce Drummond for Hill Center. So please help me thank our guests. And one last announcement, Dr. Musgrove has a few of his books, Chocolate City Outside, for sale, and he will be happy to sign those for you as well. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Great to see you. Great to hear you.